Welcome, friends. Pour yourself a drink, get comfortable, and let me take you on a journey. A journey through time, through blood and courage, through betrayal and survival. Imagine this, it's the 1830s. Florida is not yet the land of theme parks and beaches. There are no highways cutting through the landscape, no cities sprawling across the coast, no tourists with cameras and sunscreen. Instead, picture a wild, untamed peninsula. A place where Spanish moss hangs heavy from ancient cypress trees, swaying in the humid breeze like the beards of old men, where the air is thick with mystery and danger, where alligators glide silently through dark waters and panthers prowl through palmetto thickets. This is a land of swamps and hammocks, and I don't mean the kind you lounge in. A hammock, in Florida terms, is a raised island of hardwood trees in the middle of a swamp, a fortress of nature, a place where you can hide, where you can survive, where an army can disappear without a trace. And in these hammocks, in these swamps, in these wild places that white men feared to enter, lived a people who refused to disappear, the Seminoles. Now let me tell you something important right from the start. The Seminoles weren't originally from Florida. They weren't some ancient tribe that had lived there for thousands of years. They were refugees, runaways, rebels. The word Seminole comes from the Spanish cimarron, meaning wild, runaway, or separatist. It's the same word that gave us maroon, as in maroon communities, escaped slaves who formed their own societies in the wilderness. The Seminoles were Creek Indians mostly, red sticks, people who'd fled south from Georgia and Alabama, seeking freedom in the Spanish-controlled wilderness of Florida. They were joined by escaped slaves, African Americans who'd run from plantations and found refuge among people who didn't see them as property. Together, they created something new, a mixed nation, a people bound not by blood but by a shared desire for freedom. And in this wilderness they found something precious, something worth fighting for, something worth dying for: independence. Think about what that meant. In the early 1800s, if you were Native American, your world was shrinking. The United States was expanding westward like a flood. Treaties were signed and broken. Lands were taken. Peoples were moved, scattered, destroyed. But in Florida, under Spanish rule, the Seminoles had a chance, a breathing space, a place where they could live on their own terms. They built log cabins. They cleared fields and planted corn. They raised cattle and horses. They created villages with names and histories. They buried their dead in sacred ground. They weren't savages living in primitive squalor. They were farmers, ranchers, traders. They had a functioning society, a culture, a way of life. And then in 1821, everything changed. Spain sold Florida to the United States for $5 million. Just like that. A piece of paper signed in a distant capital, and suddenly 4,000 Seminoles found themselves under American rule. They didn't ask for this. They didn't vote for it. They didn't want it. But it didn't matter what they wanted. The American settlers looked at Florida and saw opportunity. They saw those Seminole log cabins, those cultivated clearings, those herds of cattle. They saw good land, valuable land, and they wanted it. Now, this is where our story really begins. This is where we meet the man who would become one of the most famous or infamous Seminole leaders. His name was Halpatter Micco, but you probably know him better as Billy Bowlegs. And before we go any further, let me clear something up. The name Bowlegs had nothing to do with his physical appearance. It was a family name. His father was also called Bowlegs. It was just a surname passed down like Smith or Jones. Billy was born around 1810, somewhere near the mouth of Chickamauga Creek. His father, Secoffer, was a warrior who hated the Spanish with a burning, all-consuming passion. And when Secoffer lay dying around 1832, he called his two sons to his bedside, Billy and his brother Payne, and he made them promise something dark, something terrible. He told them to complete his life's work, to finish what he'd started, to kill 100 Spaniards. He'd already killed 86, he said. He needed 14 more. 14 more Spanish lives to open the gates of paradise for him. The Great Spirit demanded it. Think about that for a moment. A dying father's last wish. Not for peace, not for prosperity, not for his sons to live good lives and raise families. No, he wanted revenge. He wanted blood. He wanted his sons to become killers. And in the world Billy Bowlegs grew up in, such requests were sacred. You didn't refuse your father's dying wish. You didn't question it. You honored it. This was the world of the Seminoles. A world where honor and violence were intertwined, where revenge was a duty, where the past reached out from the grave to shape the future. Billy was just a boy when his father died, maybe 22, maybe younger. But he'd already seen war. He'd already killed. When he was 12, maybe 15, the records aren't clear, he joined the Red Sticks, the hostile Creeks who were fighting against the Tennessee troops led by Generals Jackson and Floyd. Just a kid with a spear facing men with rifles. He survived. That tells you something right there. He was tough. He was smart. He was lucky. And when the war ended, when the Red Sticks were defeated, young Billy was one of the many unruly spirits who fled south to Florida, to the swamps, to the hammocks, to freedom. He settled on Pease Creek in the heart of the peninsula, far from white settlements, far from authority, far from the world that wanted to tame him. And there he lived, unknown to history for years, hunting, fishing, playing the ball games that the Seminoles loved, living free. But that freedom wouldn't last, because the Americans were coming, and they wanted Florida, all of it, and Billy Bowlegs, he was about to become famous, or infamous, depending on who's telling the story. Let me introduce you properly to Halpatter Micco. You might know him better as Billy Bowlegs. But before we talk about the warrior, the leader, the man who would defy America, let's talk about the boy. The birth of a warrior * Billy was born around 1810, somewhere near the mouth of Chickamauga Creek in what's now Alabama. The exact date, nobody knows. The Creeks didn't keep birth certificates, didn't celebrate birthdays the way white people did. What mattered wasn't when you were born. It was what you did with your life. His father was Secoffer, also known as Bowlegs, a warrior, a man with a reputation, a man with enemies, and a man with an obsession. Secoffer hated the Spanish, not just disliked them, not just opposed them, hated them with a burning, all-consuming passion that defined his entire life. Why? The records don't say. Maybe the Spanish had killed someone he loved. Maybe they'd wronged him in some way. Maybe it was just tribal politics, old grudges that had festered for generations. Whatever the reason, Secoffer made it his life's work to kill Spaniards. He kept count. 86, he claimed. 86 Spanish lives taken by his hand. And he believed, truly believed, that the Great Spirit demanded 100. That only by completing this blood sacrifice could he enter paradise. Think about growing up with a father like that. A father who measured his worth in bodies, who saw killing not as a necessary evil but as a sacred duty. Young Billy absorbed this. How could he not? Children learn what they live. He learned that honor mattered more than life, that revenge was a duty, that some debts could only be paid in blood. These weren't abstract lessons. They were the foundation of his worldview, the lens through which he'd see everything that followed. The Red Stick War * Billy was maybe 12 years old when the Creek Nation split apart. On one side, the friendly Creeks, those who wanted peace with the Americans, who were willing to adopt white ways, to farm like white men, to trade, to coexist. On the other side, the Red Sticks, the traditionalists, those who rejected white influence, who wanted to preserve the old ways, who were willing to fight. The name came from their war clubs, painted red, symbolizing blood, war, resistance. Billy's family chose the Red Stick side. Or maybe the Red Stick side chose them. Either way, young Billy found himself in a war, not as a spectator, not as a child to be protected. As a warrior, he was given a spear, maybe a club, taught how to use them, how to strike, how to kill. And then he was sent into battle, against Tennessee militiamen, against men with rifles and cannons and all the advantages of superior technology. Imagine being 12 years old, facing grown men who want to kill you, who have better weapons, better training, better everything. Some boys would have broken, would have run, would have died. Billy survived. That tells you something fundamental about him. He was tough, resilient, adaptable, or maybe just lucky. Sometimes luck is all that separates the living from the dead. The Battle of Horseshoe Bend March 27, 1814. The battle that broke the Red Stick resistance. The Red Sticks had fortified a peninsula on the Tallapoosa River, a place called Horseshoe Bend. They'd built a log barricade across the neck of the peninsula. Strong, well-designed, defensible. They had about 1,000 warriors, plus women and children. They thought they were safe. Andrew Jackson attacked with 2,000 soldiers, plus 500 Cherokee and Friendly Creek allies. The battle lasted all day. The Red Sticks fought desperately, courageously, hopelessly. Jackson's forces overwhelmed them, broke through the barricade, slaughtered the defenders. Of 1,000 Red Stick warriors, about 800 died. Was Billy there? We don't know for certain, but probably. He was the right age, the right place, the right faction. If he was there, he saw hell. He saw his people slaughtered. He saw the power of the American military machine. He saw what happened when you fought the Americans in a conventional battle, when you gave them a target, when you let them use their superior numbers and firepower. You lost. You died. You were destroyed. It was a lesson Billy would never forget, a lesson that would shape his entire military strategy in the years to come. The flight to Florida after Horseshoe Bend, the Red Stick cause was lost. The Creek Nation was broken. The survivors scattered. Many fled south, to Florida, to Spanish territory, to freedom. Billy and his mother were among them. Refugees, exiles, survivors. They walked for weeks, through forests and swamps, hungry, exhausted, afraid, but also hopeful. Because Florida represented something precious, a second chance. They settled among the Seminoles, those other refugees, those other resistors, those other people who'd chosen freedom over submission. And young Billy, now maybe 15, maybe 16, he began his new life. Becoming Seminole, the Seminoles weren't a single tribe. They were a coalition, Creeks mostly, but also Yamasees, Apalachees, escaped slaves, and others. United not by blood but by a shared desire for independence. Billy had to prove himself, had to show he belonged, had to earn his place. He learned the Seminole ways, the language, the customs, the territory. He became an expert in the Florida wilderness, the swamps, the hammocks, the rivers. He learned which plants were edible and which were poisonous, where the game was plentiful, where the water was safe. He learned to move silently through the palmetto scrub, to read tracks, to hunt alligators and deer. He became a Seminole, not by birth, but by choice, by adoption, by proving himself worthy. The ball games, one way to prove yourself was through the ball games. These weren't gentle recreational activities. They were brutal, violent contests that could last for hours and sometimes ended in serious injury or death. 2 teams, maybe 20 men per side, a ball made of deerskin stuffed with moss, 2 goals at opposite ends of a field. The objective, get the ball through the opponent's goal, by any means necessary. You could throw the ball, carry it, kick it, but you couldn't use your hands to catch it. You had to use sticks like lacrosse sticks but cruder, and you could tackle, trip, shove, hit, anything to stop the other team. It was training for war. It taught you to read your opponent's moves, to anticipate, to strike fast and hard, to take a hit and keep going. Billy excelled at it. He was fast, agile, cunning. He could read the game like a book. People noticed, respected him, saw him as a warrior, a leader. The double game asterisk, by his early 20s, Billy had made a name for himself. Not as a great chief, not yet, but as a man of promise, a rising star. He started making himself useful to the American officers at Fort King, the Indian agent, the military commanders. When soldiers deserted, Billy would track them down, bring them back. When Indians stole from white settlers, Billy would recover the property, return it. When the agent needed someone to carry messages to distant villages, Billy volunteered. The Americans loved him, trusted him, relied on him. They gave him gifts, praised him, called him a good Indian. "See," they'd say to each other, "not all Indians are savages. Some can be civilized, some can be useful." Billy smiled, nodded, accepted their gifts, played the role they wanted him to play, but he was watching, always watching, learning the Americans' weaknesses, their tactics, their blind spots, learning Fort King's defenses, its routines, its vulnerabilities, learning which officers were competent and which were fools, which could be trusted and which would betray you. He was building a network of warriors, of scouts, of people loyal to him. His followers increased, 2 men, then 5, then 10, then 20. He wasn't a chief yet, not officially, but he was becoming a man of influence, a sub-chief, a leader in the making. The mask asterisk. Here's the thing about Billy Bowlegs that the Americans never understood. He was playing a double game. To the Americans, he was cooperative, helpful, civilized. But to his own people, he was something else. A strategist, a spy, a man preparing for war. He knew the war was coming, knew it was inevitable. The Americans wanted the land, all of it, and they would take it. The only question was when, and whether the Seminoles would be ready. Billy was making sure they would be ready. He was patient. He could wait. He could smile and cooperate and play the good Indian until the moment came, until the mask could come off, until the war began. And then the Americans would see the real Billy Bowlegs, not the helpful scout, not the cooperative Indian, the warrior, the leader, the man who would make them bleed. But that moment hadn't come yet. Not in the early 1830s, not when Billy was still in his 20s. First, there would be a treaty, a betrayal, a choice. And Billy would make the wrong choice, or the right choice. Depending on your perspective, he would sign a treaty he'd come to regret, a treaty that would tear his nation apart, a treaty that would lead to war, but we'll get to that. First, let's talk about what that treaty was, what it promised, what it took away. Let's talk about Payne's Landing, the place where everything changed. Now here's where things get complicated, and I mean really complicated. Let me set the scene for you. It's 1821. Spain has just sold Florida to the United States for $5 million. Think about that. They sold an entire territory with all its people for the price of a few modern houses. The Seminoles wake up one morning and suddenly they're under American rule. 4,000 Seminoles, men, women, children, suddenly have a new government they never asked for, never voted for, never wanted. And the American settlers, they look at Florida and they see opportunity. They see those Seminole log cabins surrounded by cultivated clearings, corn growing in neat rows, cattle grazing peacefully, orchards heavy with fruit. The Seminoles had been there for decades. They'd cleared the land, built homes, created communities. They had villages with names, with histories, with graveyards where their ancestors slept. But the settlers didn't care about any of that. They saw land, good land, and they wanted it. Now the American government had a problem. They couldn't just take the land, not openly anyway. This was the 1830s, and there were still some pretenses of civilization, of law, of justice. So they came up with a solution: treaties. Make it look legal. Make it look voluntary. Get the Indians to sign away their rights. Enter James Gadsden. Secretary of War Lewis Cass sent him to Florida with one mission: get the Seminoles to agree to leave. Gadsden arrived in 1832. He was a skilled negotiator, which is a polite way of saying he was good at manipulation. He knew how to find the weak points, how to apply pressure, how to make promises that sounded good but meant nothing. He called for a council at Payne's Landing on the Ocklawaha River, May 9, 1832, the date that would change everything. Not all the chiefs came. Micanopy, the principal chief, the real leader of the Seminole nation, he was suspicious. He stayed away. He knew what this was about, but others came, some out of curiosity, some because they thought they could negotiate better terms, some because they were young and ambitious and saw an opportunity. Billy Bowlegs was there. He was in his early 20s, a sub-chief under Arpuiki. You might know him as Sam Jones. Billy was nobody important yet, just another young warrior trying to make a name for himself. Gadsden laid out the terms. The Seminoles would give up their lands in Florida, all of them. In exchange, they'd get new lands west of the Mississippi River, in what's now Oklahoma. Better lands, Gadsden promised. More fertile, more game. You'll be happier there, he promised money. Annuities, annual payments for 15 years. $3,000 a year. Sounds like nothing now, but back then it was significant. He promised they'd be supported for 1 year after arrival. Food, supplies, everything they'd need to get started. He promised they'd be paid for their improvements, their houses, their cleared fields, their cattle. And here's the kicker. He promised they'd be reunited with the Creek Nation. The Seminoles had originally split off from the Creeks. Now they'd be one people again. Some of the chiefs liked this idea. They had family among the Creeks, old connections, old friendships, but others hated it. They'd left the Creeks for a reason. They didn't want to go back. They didn't want to be under Creek authority again. And there was another problem. A big one. The Seminoles had slaves, African Americans who'd run away from plantations and found refuge among the Seminoles. Some had been there for generations. They'd married into the tribe. Had children, had lives. The Creeks wanted those slaves back. They claimed ownership. And if the Seminoles moved west and joined the Creeks, what would happen to those people? The Seminoles asked about this. Gadsden was vague. "We'll work it out," he said. "Don't worry about it." But they did worry. They worried a lot. Still, Gadsden was persuasive. He had gifts, blankets, tools, whiskey. He had threats. "If you don't sign, we'll take the land anyway. At least this way you get something." And he had Billy Bowlegs. Young Billy, ambitious Billy, saw an opportunity. If he signed, he'd be important. He'd be a chief who dealt with the Americans. He'd have status. So he signed, along with several other chiefs. 15 signatures in total, but notice who didn't sign. Micanopy, the actual head chief. The man who really spoke for the Seminole Nation. He wasn't even there. The treaty had a clause, a sneaky little clause that Gadsden slipped in. It said that a delegation of Seminoles would go west to inspect the new lands. If they approved, the treaty would be binding. 7 chiefs went. They traveled for months. They saw the land dry, harsh, nothing like Florida. They saw the Creeks, who treated them like poor relations, not equals. They came back and said, "No, we don't approve, we're not going." But Gadsden had another trick up his sleeve. He produced a document, supposedly signed by the delegation, saying they approved of the lands. The chiefs said they never signed it, that it was a forgery, that they'd been tricked. Didn't matter. The American government said the treaty was valid. The Seminoles had to leave. Now put yourself in Billy Bowlegs' position. He's in his mid-20s. He signed a treaty that's tearing his nation apart. Half the Seminoles are calling him a traitor. The other half are preparing for war. What does he do? At first, he tries to make it work. He encourages people to prepare for removal. He signs the emigration rolls. He brings in 60 or 70 Miccosukes to do the same. But he's watching. He's listening. He's hearing the anger, the fear, the desperation. And slowly, quietly, he starts to change his mind. Or maybe he never really believed in the treaty at all. Maybe he was playing a long game from the beginning. We'll never know for sure. But what we do know is this. By 1835, Billy Bowlegs had become one of the most vocal opponents of removal. The young chief who signed the treaty had become the warrior who would fight to stay. And that fight, it was about to turn very, very bloody. Because here's the thing about promises made to Native Americans in the 1830s, they were always broken. Always. The government promised support. It never came. Promised fair payment. The money disappeared into corrupt agents' pockets. Promised good lands. They were already occupied or worthless. The Seminoles had seen this happen to the Cherokees, to the Choctaws, to the Creeks themselves. They knew how this story ended, so they made a choice. They would fight. They would resist. They would make the Americans pay for every inch of Florida in blood. And Billy Bowlegs, he would lead them. December 28th, 1835, a date that would live in infamy. A date that would mark the beginning of one of America's longest and bloodiest Indian wars. Two events, same day, same hour, both orchestrated with deadly precision. Let me take you there. Let me show you what happened. The Dade Massacre ***. Major Francis Dade was a career soldier, 45 years old, experienced, confident, maybe too confident. On December 23rd, he left Fort Brooke near Tampa Bay with a column of 110 men. His mission: reinforce Fort King, about 100 miles to the north. It should have been routine, a week's march through familiar territory. The Seminoles had been quiet lately. The treaty negotiations seemed to be working. Dade wasn't worried. He even joked about it. "I've got a good command," he told friends before leaving. "If the Indians attack, we'll give them a drubbing they won't forget." His men were mostly young. Many had never seen combat. They marched in formation, 2 by 2, muskets on their shoulders, like they were on parade back in the States. They had no idea they were being watched. For 5 days, 180 Seminole warriors shadowed the column, led by Micanopy, Jumper, and Alligator. They moved through the palmetto scrub like ghosts. The soldiers never saw them, never suspected. The warriors waited, choosing their moment, choosing their ground. On the morning of December 28th, the column was crossing an open pine barren. No cover, nowhere to hide, perfect killing ground. The Seminoles were positioned in a semicircle, hidden in the tall grass and palmetto bushes. Each warrior had picked his target. Each warrior waited for the signal. Major Dade rode at the head of the column. He was probably thinking about Fort King, about a hot meal and a warm bed, about how routine this march had been. He never heard the shot that killed him. The first volley came without warning. No war whoops, no shouted challenges. Just sudden, devastating gunfire from 3 sides. Half the soldiers went down in the first 30 seconds, including Major Dade. A bullet through the heart. He was dead before he hit the ground. The survivors tried to form a defensive square. It's what they'd been trained to do. But they were in shock, confused, terrified. Captain George Gardner took command. He rallied the men, got them into some semblance of order. They started building a log breastwork, anything for cover. For hours they held out, returning fire when they could, dragging the wounded behind the logs, watching their friends die. The Seminoles didn't rush them. They didn't need to. They had all the advantages. They could shoot from cover. They could wait. Around noon, the warriors charged, overwhelming the exhausted, decimated defenders. It was over in minutes. Of 110 men who left Fort Brooke, only 4 survived. 4 privates who played dead among the corpses, then crawled away after dark. 106 soldiers dead. The worst defeat of American forces by Native Americans since St. Clair's disaster in 1791. And the Seminoles? They lost 3 warriors. 3. The murder of General Thompson * while Dade's column was being massacred. Another drama was unfolding at Fort King. General Wiley Thompson was the Indian agent, the man responsible for implementing the removal policy, the man who'd arrested Osceola, the man who'd made promises he couldn't keep. He knew he was in danger. Everyone knew. The Seminoles had made threats. There had been incidents. Tensions were high, but Thompson was stubborn, or maybe just fatalistic. He refused to hide behind the fort's walls. On the afternoon of December 28th, he decided to take a walk, just outside the fort. Fresh air, exercise, a break from the stress. He was accompanied by Lieutenant Constantine Smith and a few others. They were unarmed. It was supposed to be safe. The fort was right there. They walked along a path that led to a small pond. Talking, relaxed, unsuspecting, Osceola was waiting. He'd positioned his warriors, about 50 of them, in the trees and bushes along the path. They'd been there for hours, patient, silent, deadly. When Thompson and his party reached the killing zone, Osceola gave the signal. The first volley killed Thompson instantly. 14 bullets hit him. 14. They weren't taking any chances. Lieutenant Smith tried to run. He made it maybe 20 yards before they brought him down. The others scattered. Some made it back to the fort. Some didn't. The warriors didn't pursue them. They'd accomplished their mission. They'd killed the man who'd imprisoned Osceola, the man who'd tried to force them from their homes. Osceola walked over to Thompson's body. He looked down at the man who'd once had him arrested, the man who'd humiliated him, and he scalped him. Then he and his warriors melted back into the forest. By the time soldiers from the fort arrived, they were gone. The aftermath news of the massacres spread like wildfire. In Florida, panic. Settlers abandoned their homes, fled to the forts or to Georgia. The frontier emptied almost overnight. In Washington, outrage. How dare these savages attack American soldiers? How dare they murder a government official? President Jackson, Old Hickory himself, was furious. He'd fought Indians before. He knew how to deal with them. He ordered General Winfield Scott to Florida with reinforcements. Thousands of troops, the best the army had. Crush them, Jackson ordered. Drive them into the sea if you have to, but end this rebellion. Scott arrived in Florida confident. He had superior numbers, superior weapons, superior training. He would learn, as others had before him, that none of that mattered in the swamps and hammocks of Florida. The Seminoles had chosen their battlefield carefully. They knew every inch of this country, every trail, every hiding place, every source of water. And they had something else, something the Americans couldn't match: desperation. They were fighting for their homes, their families, their very existence. The Americans were fighting for what? Policy, politics, land they didn't need. It's hard to match the motivation of a man defending his home. The nature of the war asterisk this wasn't going to be a conventional war. No pitched battles, no sieges, no grand campaigns. This was going to be guerrilla warfare at its finest. Or worse, depending on your perspective. The Seminoles would strike from ambush, kill a few soldiers, disappear into the swamps, strike again somewhere else. They would burn supply depots, ambush patrols, snipe at sentries. They would make the Americans afraid, afraid to leave the forts, afraid to march through the forests, afraid to sleep at night. And it would work. Over the next 7 years, the United States would pour men and money into Florida. Thousands of soldiers, millions of dollars. And they would barely make a dent, because you can't fight an enemy you can't find. You can't win a war when every tree might hide a warrior, when every swamp might be an ambush. The Seminoles understood this. They'd learned it fighting the Spanish, fighting the British, fighting other tribes. They knew they couldn't beat the Americans in a straight fight, but they could make the Americans pay. They could make them bleed. They could make them regret ever coming to Florida. And Billy Bowlegs, he was about to become a master of this new kind of warfare. The cost asterisk, let me give you some numbers, because numbers tell a story. The Second Seminole War would last 7 years, from 1835 to 1842. It would cost the United States $40 million. In 1830s dollars, that's roughly $1 billion in today's money. It would cost 1,500 American soldiers their lives, most of them not from combat but from disease, yellow fever, malaria, dysentery. It would cost countless Seminole lives. We don't have exact numbers. They didn't keep records like the Americans did, but estimates range from 500 to 1,000 warriors killed, plus women and children. And for what? By the end of the war, most of the Seminoles would be gone, removed to Oklahoma, their villages burned, their cattle slaughtered, their way of life destroyed, but not all of them. A few hundred would remain, hidden deep in the Everglades, unconquered, undefeated, and their descendants are still there today. Billy's role asterisk, where was Billy Bowlegs during all this? He was there, at the beginning, learning, watching, preparing. He wasn't a major leader yet, that would come later, but he was there, fighting, surviving, gaining experience. He learned from Osceola, from Micanopy, from the other chiefs. He learned what worked and what didn't. He learned that you don't fight the Americans head-on. You hit and run. You use the terrain. You make them come to you. He learned patience, the ability to wait for the right moment, to let the enemy make mistakes. He learned ruthlessness, that in war mercy is weakness, that to survive you must be willing to do whatever it takes. These lessons would serve him well, because his time was coming. His moment in the sun, or rather, in the swamps, was just a few years away. But first, let me tell you about the raid that made him famous. The attack that turned him from a sub-chief into the chief. The raid on Colonel Harney's camp. July 22nd, 1839. The date Billy Bowlegs became a legend. Let me set the scene for you, paint you a picture of what happened that morning on the banks of the Caloosahatchee River. The setup asterisk by 1839, the war had been going on for nearly 4 years. The Americans were exhausted, frustrated, desperate for any sign of progress. Colonel William Harney was one of their best officers, tough, experienced, a veteran of multiple Indian campaigns. He'd been sent to establish a trading post on the Caloosahatchee River, deep in Seminole territory. The idea was to encourage peaceful contact, to show the Seminoles that cooperation was possible. It was a terrible idea. Commander Macomb had made an arrangement with some of the Seminole chiefs, a kind of unofficial truce. The Seminoles would stay south of a certain line. The Americans would leave them alone. It was fragile, temporary, built on mutual exhaustion rather than trust. But Harney believed in it, or at least he wanted to believe in it. He set up camp on an open plain near the river. No fortifications, no defensive positions, just 30 men in white tents sleeping under the stars. They traded with the Seminoles during the day. Friendly exchanges, smiles, handshakes, everything seemed peaceful. Harney had no idea he was being watched. Billy's plan asterisk Billy Bowlegs had been observing Harney's camp for days. He saw the lack of defenses, the casual attitude, the way the soldiers relaxed at night, confident in their safety. He saw an opportunity. Billy wasn't the senior chief. That was still Halpatter Micco, the Blue King. But Billy was the one with the plan, the one with the audacity, the one willing to take the risk. He gathered 200 warriors, not just from his own band but from several groups, men who trusted him, men who were willing to follow him into danger. He explained his plan. Simple, brutal, effective. They would attack at dawn, when the soldiers were sleeping, when their guard was down. They would strike fast, kill as many as possible, take what they could, disappear before reinforcements could arrive. Some of the older chiefs were skeptical. What about the truce? They asked. What about Macomb's arrangement? Billy's response was blunt. The Americans will break it eventually. They always do. Better we strike first. He was right, of course. The truce wouldn't have lasted. But by attacking, Billy ensured it ended on his terms. The night before July 21st, 1839, the night before the attack, 200 Seminole warriors moved through the darkness. Silent as shadows, invisible in the palmetto scrub, they surrounded Harney's camp, positioned themselves in a wide circle. Each man knew his role, his target, his escape route. They waited, patient, disciplined, professional. Billy moved among them, checking positions, offering quiet words of encouragement, making sure everyone was ready. He was 29 years old, still young, but already a leader, already someone men would follow into hell. Inside the camp the soldiers slept, unaware, unsuspecting. Harney himself was in his tent, probably dreaming of promotion, of glory, of the successful mission he was leading. He had no idea that death was crouched in the darkness, waiting for dawn. The attack, the first light of dawn. July 22nd, 1839. The sky was just beginning to lighten. That gray pre-dawn moment when the world is caught between night and day. Billy gave the signal. 200 warriors rose from the grass and charged. The war whoop shattered the morning silence, a sound that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. The soldiers woke to chaos, to screaming, to gunfire, to death. They stumbled from their tents, half-dressed, confused, terrified, reaching for weapons that weren't there, looking for cover that didn't exist. The Seminoles were among them. Shooting, stabbing, clubbing. It wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. Some soldiers tried to fight back. They died quickly. Some tried to run. They died slowly, hunted down in the palmetto scrub. Some just stood there, frozen in shock. They died too. 24 men killed in the first few minutes. 24 out of 30. Harney's escape *. Colonel Harney was in his tent when the attack began. He woke to the sound of gunfire and screaming. For a moment he didn't understand what was happening. Then training kicked in. He grabbed his pistol, burst from his tent, and saw hell. His men were dying. The camp was overrun. Warriors were everywhere. Harney was a fighter. He'd been in tough spots before, but this was hopeless. He ran, not towards his men, not towards the fight, towards the river. It was the only chance, the only escape. Warriors saw him, chased him, fired at him. Bullets kicked up dirt at his feet, whizzed past his head. He reached the riverbank, didn't hesitate, dove in. The Caloosahatchee River, dark water, strong current, alligators. Harney didn't care. He swam, desperate, frantic. Behind him, warriors lined the bank, shooting, shouting. But Harney was a strong swimmer and lucky, incredibly lucky. He made it to mid-river, saw a fishing smack anchored there, a small boat, Salvation. He swam to it, climbed aboard, collapsed on the deck, gasping, shaking. The crew hauled anchor, set sail. Got him out of there. Harney lived, but his reputation, that died on the banks of the Caloosahatchee. The aftermath. Billy and his warriors didn't pursue Harney. They had what they came for. 24 dead soldiers, weapons, ammunition, supplies, horses, and something more valuable than any of that, a victory, a statement, a message. The message was clear. The Seminoles were not defeated. They were not broken. They could still strike, still kill, still win. Billy ordered his men to strip the bodies, take everything useful, leave nothing for the Americans. Then they melted back into the wilderness. By the time reinforcements arrived, they were gone. Billy's rise * news of the raid spread quickly. Among the Seminoles, among the Americans. For the Seminoles it was a triumph, a reminder that they could still fight, still resist. And Billy Bowlegs, he was the hero of the hour. He'd planned the raid, led the warriors, struck a blow against the enemy. The older chiefs had to acknowledge his success, his courage, his leadership. Halpatter Micco was getting old, tired, ready to step aside. Billy was young, energetic, proven in battle. The transition was natural, inevitable. By the end of 1839, Billy Bowlegs was no longer a sub-chief. He was the chief, the leader of the Seminoles, not by inheritance, not by election, by achievement, by proving himself worthy. The American reaction in Washington: fury. Another defeat, another humiliation, another setback in this endless, frustrating war. Harney himself was court-martialed, accused of negligence, of failing to protect his men. He was acquitted barely, but his career never recovered. He'd always be the man who ran while his soldiers died. The military brass demanded action, more troops, more resources, more aggressive tactics, but nothing worked. The Seminoles remained elusive, dangerous, undefeated. The significance: the raid on Harney's camp was a turning point. Not in the war would drag on for years, but in Billy Bowlegs' career. Before the raid, he was just another warrior, ambitious, capable, but not special. After the raid, he was a leader, a chief, a man to be reckoned with. He would lead the Seminoles for the next 20 years, through war and peace, through defeat and survival. And it all started here, on a July morning in 1839, on the banks of the Caloosahatchee River, when a young warrior named Billy Bowlegs proved he was more than just a name. The human cost *. Let's not forget the 24 soldiers who died that morning. They were young men, most of them, far from home, serving their country. They didn't choose this war. They didn't make the policies that led to it. They were just doing their jobs, following orders, and they died badly, violently, far from home. Their families got letters, official notifications. We regret to inform you. Some of those families never recovered, never got over the loss. War is like that. It doesn't just kill soldiers, it kills families, communities, futures. The Seminoles knew this. They'd lost plenty of their own. Fathers, brothers, sons. But they couldn't afford mercy. Couldn't afford to think of the enemy as human. Because if you start thinking of the enemy as human, you can't kill them. And if you can't kill them, you lose. And losing meant extinction. Billy's thoughts, we don't know what Billy thought that night, after the raid, after the killing. Did he celebrate? Did he mourn? Did he feel anything at all? The historical record is silent. But I imagine him sitting alone, away from the celebrating warriors, looking at the weapons they'd captured, the supplies they'd taken, thinking about the men they'd killed, the man who'd escaped, thinking about what came next. Because Billy was smart enough to know this wasn't over. This was just beginning. The Americans would come back, stronger, angrier, more determined, and the Seminoles, they would fight, because what else could they do? Surrender meant removal. Removal meant death. Maybe not immediate, but eventual, certain. So they would fight, and Billy would lead them for as long as he could, for as long as they could hold out, against an enemy with infinite resources, infinite patience, infinite determination. It was a losing battle. Billy probably knew that. But he fought anyway, because that's what leaders do. They fight the battles that need fighting, even the ones they can't win. The years between 1839 and 1842 were the hardest, for both sides. For the Americans, it was a nightmare of frustration. They had the men, they had the weapons, they had the resources, but they couldn't win. For the Seminoles, it was a fight for survival, every day, every hour, every minute. Let me tell you what those years were like. The Seminole strategy, Billy Bowlegs and the other chiefs had learned their lesson well. You don't fight the Americans in open battle. You don't give them a target. You don't let them use their superior numbers and firepower. Instead, you disappear. The Everglades became their fortress, that vast, trackless wilderness of sawgrass and cypress swamps, a place where white men got lost and died. But the Seminoles knew it. Every hammock, every creek, every path through the sawgrass. They built hidden camps deep in the swamps, platforms raised above the water, accessible only by canoe through channels that looked like solid grass. They cached supplies, buried weapons, created escape routes, and they waited. When American patrols came close, the Seminoles would watch from hiding. If the patrol was small, they'd attack, quick, brutal, then disappear before reinforcements could arrive. If the patrol was large, they'd just melt away. Let the Americans thrash around in the swamps. Let the heat and mosquitoes and disease do the work for them. It was guerrilla warfare at its finest, and it drove the Americans crazy. Life in the Everglades, but don't romanticize it. Life in the Everglades was hard, brutally hard. The Seminoles were refugees in their own land, driven from their villages, their farms, their homes. They lived on platforms in the swamps, sleeping on palmetto fronds, eating whatever they could hunt or gather. Fish, turtles, alligators, roots, berries, whatever they could find. The children grew up knowing nothing but war, knowing nothing but hiding, knowing nothing but fear. The women did the impossible. They kept families together. They cooked over smokeless fires because smoke would give away their position. They tended the sick and wounded with no medicine, no doctors, nothing but herbs and prayers. The old people suffered most. The constant moving, the poor food, the stress. Many died, not from bullets, from exhaustion, from disease, from broken hearts. But they endured, because what choice did they have? The American frustration asterisk general after general came to Florida. Each one confident. Each one certain he'd be the one to end this war. Each one failed. General Winfield Scott, one of America's best. He brought thousands of troops, planned elaborate campaigns, coordinated movements. The Seminoles avoided him, struck at his supply lines, ambushed his patrols, made him look foolish. Scott was recalled in disgrace. General Thomas Jessup, ruthless, pragmatic, willing to do whatever it took. He tried negotiation, bribery, treachery. He captured Osceola under a flag of truce, a stain on American honor that's never been washed away. But even Jessup couldn't win. The Seminoles just kept fighting. General Zachary Taylor, future president, he tried a different approach. Built a line of forts, tried to contain the Seminoles, squeeze them into submission. Didn't work. The Seminoles just slipped through the gaps, struck where he wasn't looking. Taylor gave up. Requested transfer. Got it. The disease, more American soldiers died of disease than combat. Far more: yellow fever, malaria, dysentery, typhoid. The Florida climate was deadly, hot, humid, full of mosquitoes and bad water. Soldiers would arrive healthy. Within weeks they'd be sick. Within months many were dead. The hospitals were overwhelmed. The doctors helpless. They didn't understand germ theory yet. Didn't know about mosquitoes spreading disease. They just watched men die. Young men, strong men, dying of fevers they couldn't cure. It was demoralizing, terrifying. Many soldiers would rather face Seminole warriors than face another summer in Florida. The Seminole losses, but the Seminoles were suffering too. Don't think they weren't. Every skirmish cost them warriors they couldn't replace. Every ambush risked discovery of their camps. And the Americans were learning, slowly, painfully, but learning. They started using bloodhounds, dogs trained to track humans. The Seminoles hated and feared these dogs. They started using Creek and Cherokee scouts, Indians who knew how to fight Indians, who could track through swamps, who couldn't be fooled by the old tricks. They started destroying food sources, burning fields, killing cattle, making it harder for the Seminoles to survive. It was working. Slowly but working. The Seminoles were getting weaker, hungrier, more desperate. The breaking point: asterisk by 1842, both sides were exhausted. The Americans had spent $40 million, lost 1,500 soldiers, gained almost nothing. The Seminoles had lost hundreds of warriors, thousands of people removed, their way of life destroyed. Something had to give. In May 1842, Colonel William Worth, the latest American commander, made an offer. The Seminoles could stay in a small territory in the southern part of Florida, away from white settlements. It wasn't much, a fraction of their original lands, but it was something. And more importantly, it was survival. Billy Bowlegs and the other chiefs met to discuss it. It was a hard decision, a bitter decision. Some wanted to keep fighting. We can outlast them, they said. We can win. But Billy knew better. He'd seen the cost, the suffering, the slow grinding down of his people. They couldn't win, not really. They could survive. That was all, so they agreed. Reluctantly, bitterly, but they agreed. On August 14, 1842, the war officially ended. The Seminoles would stay in Florida in a small reservation, under American supervision. It was a defeat, but it was also a victory, because they were still there, still Seminole, still free in a way. The uneasy peace, the peace that followed, was fragile, tense, built on mutual exhaustion rather than trust. The Seminoles stayed in their assigned territory. Mostly, they hunted, fished, tried to rebuild their lives. The Americans watched them, suspicious, waiting for an excuse to finish the job. Billy Bowlegs became the principal chief, the leader of what remained of the Seminole nation. It was a poisoned chalice. He had responsibility without power, authority without resources. He had to keep his people fed, safe, out of trouble. He had to deal with American officials who didn't respect him, who saw him as a defeated enemy, not a leader. He had to balance the demands of his own people, some of whom wanted to keep fighting, with the reality of American power. It was an impossible job, but Billy did it, for years, for more than a decade. He kept the peace, mostly. There were incidents, skirmishes, tensions, but no war, not yet. The cost of survival. What did survival cost the Seminoles? Everything. Their lands, their way of life, their independence. They went from a proud, free people to a supervised, restricted population. They couldn't hunt where they wanted, couldn't travel where they wanted, couldn't live where they wanted. They were dependent on American rations, American goods, American permission. It was humiliating, degrading, soul-crushing. Many couldn't take it. They left, joined the groups that had already been removed to Oklahoma. Better to start over somewhere new than to live like this. like prisoners in their own land, but some stayed, including Billy, including Sam Jones, the old chief who'd never surrender. They stayed because this was home, this was Florida, this was where their ancestors were buried, and they would stay, no matter what it cost. Billy's reflection: we don't have Billy's words from this period. No speeches, no letters, no diary, but I imagine him in those quiet moments thinking about what had been lost, thinking about the villages that used to dot the Florida landscape, gone now, burned or abandoned, thinking about the warriors who died, the families torn apart, the children who'd never known peace, thinking about his father's dying wish, to kill 100 Spaniards, to avenge old wrongs. Had Billy fulfilled that wish? Had he avenged anything? Or had he just added more death to an endless cycle of violence? I imagine him wondering if it had been worth it. The fighting, the killing, the suffering. They'd kept a piece of Florida, a small piece, but a piece. Was that enough? Was that victory? Or was it just a slower form of defeat? The gathering storm, the peace, lasted 14 years, from 1842 to 1856, 14 years of uneasy coexistence, of simmering tensions, of unresolved grievances. The Americans wanted the Seminoles gone, all of them. They didn't like having savages in Florida. It was bad for settlement, bad for business, bad for progress. The Seminoles wanted to be left alone, to live in peace, to raise their children, to remember their dead. Neither side got what they wanted, and in 1856 the tensions would boil over. The war would start again. But that's a story for later. For now, let's talk about how it all ended. How Billy Bowlegs, the great chief, the legendary warrior, finally left Florida, not in glory, not in triumph, but in defeat, in exile, in sorrow. 1856, the peace shattered. After 14 years of uneasy coexistence, the war started again. Not because the Seminoles wanted it, but because the Americans wouldn't let them be. Surveyors entered Seminole lands without permission, without respect. They trampled gardens, destroyed property, acted like they owned the place, which in their minds they did. The Seminoles protested, complained to the authorities, asked for justice. They got nothing, so they took matters into their own hands. A surveying party was attacked, some men were killed, and just like that the war was back on. The Third Seminole War, it wasn't like the First War. Not as big, not as bloody, not as desperate. Both sides were tired. Both sides knew how this would end, but they went through the motions anyway. Skirmishes, raids, ambushes. The Americans brought in more troops. The Seminoles retreated deeper into the swamps. The same old dance, the same old story. But this time the Americans had a new weapon, not guns, not soldiers, money. They offered to pay the Seminoles to leave, generous payments, support for a year, transportation to Oklahoma. And they offered it to individuals, not just chiefs. Divide and conquer. Some Seminoles took the deal, families, small groups. They were tired, hungry, ready to try something new. Billy watched his people leave. One by one, group by group. He knew what was happening. He knew what it meant. Billy's decision in 1858, Billy Bowlegs made the hardest decision of his life. He agreed to leave Florida, not because he wanted to, not because he thought it was right, but because he had no choice. His people were starving, dying, disappearing. The Americans would never stop, never give up, never leave them in peace. He could keep fighting, keep resisting, keep watching his people suffer. Or he could accept the inevitable, take what he could get, try to save what remained. He chose survival, again. In the spring of 1858, Billy Bowlegs left Florida with 33 warriors, 80 women and children, his wives. His children, his followers, the people who'd trusted him, followed him, believed in him. They boarded a ship in Tampa Bay, headed for New Orleans, then up the Mississippi, to Oklahoma, to exile. The journey was surreal, dreamlike, nightmarish. Billy stood on the deck of the ship, watched the Florida coast disappear, the land he'd fought for, bled for, killed for, gone. In New Orleans, they were celebrities. The wild Indians from Florida, people came to see them, to stare, to point. Billy was invited to parties, dinners, receptions. He was the lion of the season, the exotic savage, the noble warrior, and he discovered alcohol, the great chief, the legendary warrior, the man who defied America for decades. Drunk in the streets of New Orleans. It's a sad image, a pathetic image, but also a human one. Billy Bowlegs wasn't a superhero. He was a man who'd lost everything, a man who'd failed his people. And he drowned his sorrows the way men have always drowned their sorrows. They arrived in Oklahoma in the summer of 1858. It was nothing like Florida. Dry, hot, dusty. No swamps, no hammocks, no Spanish moss, just endless prairie and Creek Indians who looked down on them, who saw them as poor relations, defeated enemies. Billy tried to make it work. He settled his people, helped them build homes, plant crops, but his heart wasn't in it. How could it be? He'd spent his whole life in Florida, fighting for Florida, dreaming of Florida, and now he was here, in this alien land, this prison without walls. He lived for a few more years. We don't know exactly how many. The records are vague. But sometime in the early 1860s, Billy Bowlegs died. He was about 50 years old. His fortune of $100,000 payment from the government was gone, spent, wasted. His people were scattered, broken, trying to rebuild in a land that wasn't home. And Billy, he was just another name in the history books, another defeated chief, another footnote. But here's the thing, Billy Bowlegs didn't completely fail. Because while he left Florida, not all the Seminoles did. Sam Jones, that old warrior, almost 100 years old, he refused to leave. Absolutely refused. I was born in Florida, he said. I will die in Florida. 38 warriors stayed with him, and their families. They retreated deep into the Everglades, deeper than the Americans could follow, and they stayed. Through the Civil War, through Reconstruction, through the 20th century, they stayed. And their descendants are still there, still Seminole, still in Florida. The Seminole tribe of Florida. The Miccosukee tribe. Unconquered, undefeated, they run casinos now. They're wealthy, powerful, influential, but they remember the wars, the suffering, the resistance. They remember Billy Bowlegs and Sam Jones, and all the others who fought. And they're still there, still Seminole, still in Florida. Final reflection: so was Billy Bowlegs a success or a failure? He fought for decades, led his people through impossible times, made hard choices. He signed a treaty he came to regret. He led a war he couldn't win. He accepted an exile he didn't want. But his people survived, not all of them. Not in the way he wanted, but they survived. And maybe that's all any leader can hope for. To keep their people alive, to give them a chance at a future. Billy Bowlegs did that, at great cost, with great sacrifice, but he did it. Next time you're in Florida, remember him, remember the Seminoles, remember the price they paid for that land. And remember that beneath the theme parks and the condos, beneath the highways and the shopping malls, there's a history written in blood and courage. The history of a people who refused to disappear. Take a break, stretch your legs, get some water. When you come back, we'll talk about the medicine men, the mystics, the dreamers, and the prophets, the spiritual side of Native American life. It's a different kind of story, but just as important. See you in next chapter.